They tried to bury me in the walls of my own ancestral home, claiming I was as unstable as the mother I lost. While my husband forged my name to fund his mistress, my mother-in-law was already prepping my room in a psychiatric ward. Tonight, they're going to pay for everything they've done. My father always said you can't hide the truth from a house. You can paint over the cracks, you can polish the brass until it blinds the neighbors, but the foundation knows. That morning, I stood on the second-story piazza of my family's house on Church Street, my palms resting on the cypress railing. It felt soft under my hands. 200 years of Atlantic salt, and the silent crawl of termites had finally won. The house was weeping from the inside, and I was the only one who could hear it. "Elena, dear, are you up there dreaming again?" The voice was like pulled sugar-sweet brittle and likely to cut you if you handled it wrong. Beatrice Thorne stepped onto the piazza. Her heels tapped against the mahogany floorboards with the rhythmic precision of a firing squad. She looked exactly like Charleston high society expected her to, hair coiffed into a silver helmet, a twin set of pearls that cost more than my first college tuition, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She stopped 2 feet away, her nose wrinkling just a fraction of an inch. "This dress, Elena." She began reaching out to brush a speck of invisible dust from my shoulder. "It's so practical. Heavy linen. It reminds me so much of your father's masonry crew. It's wonderful how you never truly forget your roots, even now that you're a thorn." A year ago, I would have apologized. I would have run inside to change into the pastel silk she preferred. Not today. I kept my eyes on the shifting gray of the harbor. "It's a good thing I know how to fix what's broken, Mother. Because this house, it sounds like it's crying from the inside." Beatrice stifled a tiny melodic laugh. "Oh, bless your heart. You and your buildings. Always looking for structural failure where there is only history." Julian is downstairs. He's quite excited about the restoration plans. He's invested so much of his own capital into saving this old pile of bricks. You really should show more gratitude. Gratitude. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. I walked past her, my work boots clumping heavily against her delicate sensibilities. I found Julian in the grand foyer, surrounded by blueprints and the scent of expensive bourbon. He looked every bit the Southern gentleman, broad shoulders, a linen suit that didn't have a single wrinkle, and a face that could sell ice to an Eskimo. "There she is," Julian beamed, spreading his arms wide. He didn't kiss me, he performed a kiss for the benefit of the room. "The best forensic architect in the South. Ready to see how I'm going to make this place legendary again." I looked at the blueprints spread across the antique table. They were beautiful, grandiose, and according to my quick mental math, they cost 3 times what we had in our joint savings. "It's a lot of steel." "Julian," I said, my voice clinical, "the soil here is soft. If you add this much weight without reinforcing the pilings, the whole structure will start to list." "Nonsense." He dismissed me with a wink, sliding his hand down my back. It felt like a snake moving through tall grass. "I've got it all handled. I've even taken care of the boring paperwork. You've been so exhausted with your father's recovery, I didn't want to burden you with the dry stuff." He leaned in, his breath smelling of mint and oak-aged whiskey. "I just need you to trust my instincts, Elle. I'm the builder here. You just find the faults. Let's keep those roles separate, okay?" He squeezed my shoulder a little too hard. Julian left for the club 20 minutes later. The house fell silent except for the distant drip of a leaky faucet and the hum of the air conditioner struggling against the South Carolina heat. I retreated to my home office, the only room Julian wasn't allowed to restore. I sat at my desk and pulled out my laptop. My eyes felt gritty. Decision fatigue was a real thing, a mental fog that Julian had been using against me for months. I reached into the bottom drawer to grab my chargers, but my hand hit something else. A crumpled envelope tucked into the very back of the mahogany desk, hidden behind a stack of structural reports. It was addressed to me, but the seal had been broken. A formal notice from the county tax assessor. I flattened the paper on the desk. My heart didn't race. It slowed down a cold, heavy thud in my chest. According to the document, the property taxes for 42 Church Street hadn't been paid in 18 months. There was a lien on the house. But that wasn't the part that made the room tilt. There was an attachment. A copy of a quitclaim deed filed 3 months ago. I stared at the bottom of the page. At the signature that looked exactly like mine. The elegant E and the sharp V I had practiced since I was a girl. I hadn't signed this. I had been in the hospital with my father the day this was time-stamped. I looked up at the ceiling at the ornate plaster crown molding Julian had just had repainted. The house wasn't just crying. It was being stripped bare while I was told to be grateful for the paint. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Harrison, it's Elena Vance. I need a forensic accountant, and I need him to be a ghost. The morning sun in Charleston doesn't rise so much as it bruises the sky, a heavy violet heat that settles over the cobblestones before the first tourist trolley even rattles to life. I sat in my office at Vance & Associates, the air conditioning humming a sterile mechanical tune that failed to cut through the tightness in my chest. On my mahogany drafting table lay the tools of my trade, a precision scale, a set of 2H pencils, and a high-resolution monitor displaying the digital archives of the Charleston County Register of Deeds. I zoomed in on the signature. The ink was digital, but the flow was wrong. Whoever had traced my name or used a clipped signature from an old tax return had lacked the necessary drag. My real signature has a slight hesitation at the V for a relic of a broken wrist from a fall off a scaffolding when I was 22. This V was too smooth, too confident. It was a forgery of a woman who didn't exist. I checked the timestamp. August 14th, the day my father had his second stroke. While I was sitting in a plastic chair in the ICU listening to the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator, Julian was filing the paperwork to strip the earth from beneath my feet. This wasn't a sudden impulse. My hand reached for a yellow Ticonderoga pencil. I didn't realize I was gripping it until the wood groaned. Snap. The pencil splintered the graphite core, snapping into 2 jagged pieces that rolled across the technical drawing of a collapsed warehouse in North Charleston. I picked up the broken pieces and placed them neatly in the trash. Evening at Church Street felt like being trapped inside a gilded reliquary. The house was quiet, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the humid twilight. Julian was already home, the scent of a bold, expensive Cabernet Sauvignon filling the dining room. He had lit the candles in the silver candelabra, Beatrice's favorite, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper like ghosts. "You're late, Elle," Julian said, pouring a glass of deep red wine. He looked radiant. There was a vibrancy to his skin, a hum of predatory energy that usually preceded a major contract closing. He walked toward me, holding out a glass. "But I'll forgive you. I brought home a bottle of the 18 Stag's Leap to celebrate." "Celebrate what, Julian?" I asked. I stayed by the doorway, my briefcase still gripped in my hand. I felt the weight of the forged deed inside it like a lead pipe. He leaned against the sideboard, the picture of Southern grace. "The future. I finalized the financing for the restoration today. A $500,000 home equity line of credit. We have the capital now, Elena. We can finally strip away the rot and give this house the bones it deserves." I watched him. I looked for the tell, the twitch in his jaw, the shift in his eyes. There was nothing. $500,000 is a heavy amortization for a house that was already paid for, I said, my voice as flat as a spirit level. "And I don't recall signing the mortgage application." Julian didn't miss a beat. He took a slow, appreciative sip of his wine, the red liquid staining his lips. He walked closer, stepping into my personal space until I could smell the expensive oak of the wine and the faint, sharp tang of his cologne. "That's the problem, Elena," he whispered, his voice dripping with a practiced masculine disappointment. He reached up, his thumb grazing my cheekbone. It felt like a cold stone. I did all of this for us. You've been so utterly consumed by other people's buildings, by your father's hospital bills, and your forensic obsession that you've forgotten your own home. You've let this place fall into disrepair. You weren't here to make the hard choices, so I had to step up. I had to be the one to protect the Thorne legacy. He shook his head, a patronizing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You should be thanking me for handling the burden you were too exhausted to carry. I'm trying to save you, Elle, even if you're too stubborn to see the cracks in your own foundation. I'm going to take a bath, I said, stepping back from his touch. I'm tired, Julian. Of course you are, he cooed, turning back to the wine. Rest up. We have a big week ahead. The Thorne name is about to mean something in this city again. I didn't take a bath. I sat on the edge of the bed in the darkened master suite, the blue light of my phone the only thing illuminating the room. I was scrolling through the Discover feed on Instagram, a mindless habit I used to decompress. Then I saw it. It was a post from a high-end interior designer Julian often consulted with. A series of photos titled Charleston's New Height of Luxury. I swiped through the images. Minimalist marble, floor-to-ceiling glass, a wraparound balcony with a breathtaking unobstructed view of the Cooper River and the Ravenel Bridge. It was the penthouse at the Jasper, the most exclusive new address in the city. Julian had mentioned this project months ago. He said he was doing the custom millwork for a demanding private client from New York. I zoomed in on the third photo, a shot of the sunset reflecting off a bottle of champagne on the terrace. My heart stopped. There in the reflection of the glass door was Julian. He wasn't wearing his work clothes. He was in a silk robe, his arm draped casually over the back of a designer lounge chair. He looked like the king of the world. He looked like the owner. But it was the shadow behind him that made the air vanish from my lungs. A woman was standing in the doorway, her silhouette blurred by the light, but the posture was unmistakable. She was holding a wine glass, her head tilted back in a laugh I could almost hear through the screen. She was wearing a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a pendant that caught the light. I knew that pendant. It was a vintage gold sand dollar. I had seen it on Beatrice's vanity a dozen times. Julian hadn't just mortgaged my father's house to fund a tech startup or a restoration. He had mortgaged it to build a private sanctuary for himself and a ghost, all while his mother watched from the sidelines or perhaps guided his hand. I stared at the image until the blue light burned my retinas. The house on Church Street was a lien on my soul, but the penthouse at the Jasper was the crime scene. I took a screenshot. Then I opened my professional calendar. I didn't schedule a meeting or a site visit. I looked at the date of the Thorne Ballet's 50th anniversary gala. 2 weeks. Julian. I whispered into the dark room, my voice as cold as the Atlantic in February. You really should have checked the load-bearing capacity of your lies. The humidity had reached its suffocating peak by 5 p.m. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the threat of a thunderstorm that refused to break. I was walking toward my car parked near the rear alley of the Church Street house when a flash of weathered oak caught my eye. It was sticking out from beneath a pile of broken drywall and jagged shards of slate in the debris bin Julian had rented. I stopped. The air felt like it was thickening, turning to sludge in my lungs. I pushed aside a heavy slab of discarded plaster, ignoring the dust that coated my silk sleeves. Beneath the waist lay my father's tool chest. It was a masterpiece he had built when he was 19, dovetail joints so precise they looked grown rather than made, hand-rubbed with linseed oil until it glowed like honey. Now it was caked in pluff mud. The brass hinges, once polished to a mirror finish, were weeping green oxidation. I opened the lid. The interior, which used to smell of cedar and honest labor, now reeked of mildew and neglect. His hand-planes tools he had treated with more reverence than a Bible were rusting, their steel blades pitted by the salt air. Julian hadn't moved it. He had discarded it. I stood there for a long time, the distant roll of thunder vibrating in the soles of my boots. I didn't feel the heat anymore. Something inside me, the soft, hopeful part that had kept trying to find excuses for Julian, simply went cold. It was a clean break, like a dry branch snapping under the weight of ice. I sat in my Volvo, the engine idling, the air conditioning blasting a freezing synthetic wind against my face. I pulled out my phone. "Harrison," I said, when the forensic accountant picked up on the second ring. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, low, melodic, and entirely devoid of heat. "I need the deep dive on Palmetto Heritage Restoration, LLC. Check every subcontractor. Check the material suppliers. I want to know where every ounce of that $500,000 line of credit went." "I'm on it, Elena," Harrison replied, his voice professional but tinged with concern. "And the other thing, the person you asked for. I'm calling him now." I dialed the second number. This wasn't a local family lawyer. This was Arthur Sterling, a man the Charleston elite whispered about in hushed, terrified tones. They called him the Great White. He didn't handle divorces. He handled executions. "Sterling!" The voice crackled. It sounded like two stones grinding together. "It's Elena Vance. I'm calling about 42 Church Street. The Thorne property." "My property," I corrected him. "I don't want a settlement, Arthur. I want a complete structural audit of a fraud. I want the names stripped from the deed and Julian Thorne left with nothing but the clothes he forged his way into." "That's a high-velocity request, Mrs. Vance. It'll be expensive. I know exactly what it costs to tear a house down, Arthur. Just make sure the debris is hauled away permanently." 2:14 a.m. The house was breathing. In the deep silence of a Charleston night, an old building groans as the wood contracts, the joints settling into the cooling earth. I stood in the grand foyer, dressed in dark leggings and a soft cotton shirt, my breath hitching in the dark. Julian was asleep in the master suite, likely dreaming of his Cooper River sanctuary. I reached into my bag and pulled out the FLIR T1020. It's a high-definition thermal imaging camera, a piece of equipment that costs more than a mid-sized sedan. To the naked eye, the foyer looked spectacular. Julian had just finished the structural reinforcement of the main load-bearing wall. It was covered in fresh, expensive-looking horsehair plaster and hand-carved molding. I flicked the switch. The screen flickered to life, bathing my face in a ghostly neon glow. I raised the lens. Through the LCD screen, the world transformed. The warm, solid mahogany of the floorboards showed as deep reds and oranges. But as I panned the camera toward the reinforced wall, the color bled away. Instead of the vibrant, fiery red of solid steel beams or the dense orange of heart pine joists, the screen was filled with a hollow, abyssal blue. Blue. In thermal imaging, blue means cold. It means empty space. I leaned closer, my heart thudding against my ribs. Julian hadn't reinforced the wall at all. He had removed the original structural dams and replaced them with cheap, light-gauge aluminum studs, materials meant for a temporary office partition, not a 200-year-old historic landmark. He had skimped on the very bones of the house, pocketing the difference while leaving the ceiling above us resting on a prayer. I moved to the next room, then the next. It was the same everywhere. A massacre of structural integrity. Cheap drywall, where there should be lath. Synthetic insulation, where there should be treated wool. I lowered the camera, my hands shaking. Not out of fear, but out of a cold, crystalline rage. He didn't just take the money, I thought, looking at the blue silhouettes of the hollow walls. He wanted to erase my identity. He wanted to turn my father's legacy into a shell so he could fill his own pockets. He chose the wrong opponent. I raised the camera again and hit the shutter button. Click. The digital flash was a tiny, sharp spark in the darkness. I looked at the image on the screen, a vibrant, terrifying map of Julian's greed. I didn't need a confession. I had the thermal signature of his betrayal. In the distance, a cricket chirped in the floorboards, a tiny rhythmic sound in the hollowed-out silence of the house. I tucked the camera away and slipped back into the shadows. The storm was finally beginning to break over Charleston, the first heavy drops of rain hitting the piazza like pebbles. The foundation was gone, Julian, and I'm the only one who knows how to trigger the collapse. The dawn in Charleston was a bruise-colored mist clinging to the windows of the Thorne kitchen like a secret that refused to be told. I found Martha in the gray light, the steam from her tea rising in a slow, ghostly spiral. She had been the Thornes' housekeeper for 40 years, part of the furniture, an invisible ear against the wallpaper of their lives. She didn't look up when I entered. She simply slid a heavy tarnished brass key across the reclaimed oak table. It made a sharp metallic sound against the wood. "He keeps it in the bottom left drawer of the mahogany desk at the office," Martha whispered. Her voice was thin, but it held the strength of iron. She finally looked at me, her eyes weary, filmed with the ghosts of everything she had been forced to witness. "Under the false velvet lining. It's where the dead things are kept." I looked at the key. It felt cold even in the humid morning. "Why, Martha?" She tightened her grip on her mug, her knuckles like pale stones. "I've watched them bleed Charleston dry long enough, Elena. I've seen them strip the dignity from people better than them. My mother served his grandfather. I'm done serving ghosts." She stood up, her posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. "Do what you have to do, Elena. Don't let the fire go out." The hospital room was a sterile white box smelling of antiseptic and faded hope. My father, Caleb Vance, lay against the pillows. His hands, once the most skilled tools in the South, were now gnarled and trembling, resting on the thin sheets like discarded wood. His eyes, however, were still the eyes of a master craftsman. Sharp, clear. I spread the original 19th century blueprints of the Church Street house across his lap. "Dad," I whispered, leaning close. "Julian is hiding the real records, the Palmetto Heritage contracts. I know they're in the house, but the thermal scans show hollow walls everywhere. Where would a coward hide his shame?" Caleb didn't make a sound. The aphasia had stolen his words, but it hadn't touched his memory. His trembling finger moved across the vellum, tracing the lines of the foundation. He stopped at a small archaic symbol near the fireplace in the library, a mason's mark hidden behind the heavy heart pine paneling. He tapped it twice, his eyes burning into mine with a fierce, desperate urgency. It was a hidden compartment. A priest hole meant for silver during the Civil War, known only to the men who had restored the house a generation ago. Caleb's hand closed over mine, his grip surprisingly strong. A silent command. "Finish it." I was sitting on a cold wrought iron bench in the hospital garden when the digital bomb detonated in my palm. My phone vibrated, a high-priority alert from Harrison. I opened the email. The text was a stark clinical white against the screen. "Elena, the 500,000 wasn't just for the Jasper penthouse or the mistress. It's worse. Julian has been using Palmetto Heritage to move funds for a regional construction syndicate. He's been lapping invoices to cover a massive shortfall. This isn't just civil fraud anymore. This is a RICO predicate. Julian isn't just lying to you. He's playing with federal fire. If this building collapses, the FBI is going to be the one picking up the pieces. We need to move. Now." The air in the garden suddenly felt freezing. RICO, racketeering, organized crime. Julian hadn't just built a house of cards. He had built a fortress of federal felonies. I looked down at the brass key Martha had given me. I squeezed it in my fist, the jagged edges of the metal biting deep into my skin. I didn't loosen my grip. I welcomed the pain. When I finally opened my hand, the shape of the key was branded into my palm, a deep, angry red mark. The mists were lifting over Charleston, but for Julian Thorne, the darkness was just beginning to settle in. The Jasper is a glass middle finger aimed at the historic heart of Charleston. It's a temple of steel floor-to-ceiling windows and white marble so polished it feels like walking on frozen milk. It doesn't smell of history. It smells of ozone, expensive air filtration, and the desperate scent of new money trying to buy a view. I didn't enter through the lobby. Every modern high-rise has a back door for the people who keep the machine running. I used the service elevator access code I'd memorized from a structural audit I performed on the building's sister site 6 months ago. The penthouse hallway was silent, the carpet thick enough to swallow my footsteps. I stood in the darkened alcove of the mechanical room, looking through the glass fire door that connected to the Jasper's wraparound terrace. The Cooper River shimmered below like a sheet of hammered silver, the lights of the Ravenel Bridge blinking in the humid distance. Inside the penthouse, the lighting was a dim, moody amber. Julian was there. He was draped over a white leather sofa that cost more than a year's tuition at the Thorne Ballet. He wasn't alone. A girl, Sienna, the designer from the Instagram post, was sitting on the edge of the marble island, swirling a glass of the same 18 Stag's Leap Julian had brought home to Church Street. I raised my phone, the camera lens pressed against the glass. I felt the cold clarity of a data point being confirmed. "She's getting suspicious, Jules." Sienna's voice carried through the slightly ajar terrace door, thin and whiny. "She's an architect. She knows what things cost. How long do we have to play this game?" Julian let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. He stood up, walking toward her with that predatory grace I had once mistaken for confidence. He pulled her close, his hand resting on the small of her back, in the exact same spot he'd touched me just 48 hours ago. "Elena," Julian scoffed. "My wife is just a stone wallet, babe. Hard, cold, and full of the capital I need. She thinks she's saving her father's legacy, but she's just funding ours." He leaned in, his voice dropping into a register of casual cruelty that made my stomach tilt. "Don't worry about her. When the Church Street restoration is finished and the insurance claim on the structural failure is filed, she'll be tucked away. She's already showing signs of the same instability her mother had. A few more months of gaslighting a friendly doctor's recommendation, and she'll be in a psychiatric hospital just like the woman before her. I'll be her legal conservator. And you'll be the new mistress of the Thorne estate." I felt the bile rise in my throat. It wasn't just the theft. It was the plan to weaponize my mother's tragedy, the woman who had withered away in a sanitarium while I was a child, to erase me from my own life. I kept the camera steady. Julian's phone chimed on the coffee table. He picked it up, a smirk playing on his stained lips. "Speaking of the matriarch..." He tapped the screen and held it out so Sienna could see. I zoomed in with the digital 10 times crop. It was a message thread with Beatrice. "Beatrice. Do what needs to be done, Julian. You know what I need. The Thorne name needs a blood successor, not a dusty technician with a hard hat." Sienna giggled, kissing his jaw. "Your mother is terrifying." "She's practical," Julian replied. "She knows the school is on the line." Julian headed into the bedroom with Sienna, leaving his laptop open on the marble island. I slipped through the terrace door, my movements as precise as a draftsman's pen. I inserted the encrypted USB drive Harrison had given me into Julian's MacBook. The Ghost software began its work, vacuuming every local file, every cached email, every hidden ledger. I stood in the darkness of the kitchen, surrounded by the shimmering lights of Charleston, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen. My eyes flickered to a folder marked Matriarch Private. I opened it. My breath caught. It wasn't a restoration plan. It was a liquidation schedule. Beatrice Thorne was broke. She owed Coastal Heritage Bank $1.2 million in delinquent commercial loans. The Thorne School of Ballet, the soul of Charleston, was the primary collateral. The bank had already issued a final notice. Julian wasn't just building a life for Sienna. He was desperately trying to launder the $500,000 from my house to pay off the interest on Beatrice's debt, hoping the restoration grant from the city would cover the rest. They weren't a dynasty. They were parasites feeding on the bones of my father's work. The USB drive pulsed blue. Transfer complete. I pulled the drive and slipped back onto the terrace, disappearing into the humid Charleston night, just as Julian's laughter echoed from the bedroom. I sat in my car 3 blocks away, the blue glow of my laptop reflecting in my eyes. I looked at the $1.2 million figure on Beatrice's default notice. Beatrice wanted a successor. She wanted someone to carry the weight of the Thorne name into the next generation. I leaned back against the headrest, a smile spreading across my face, a smile that held no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had just found the heart of the den. "You want a successor, Beatrice?" I whispered into the silence of the car. "I'm going to give you something much more permanent. I'm going to give you a creditor." Harrison's office in North Charleston was a cathedral of glass and black steel designed to make people feel small. From the 32nd floor, the industrial cranes of the shipyard looked like prehistoric birds frozen in a landscape of gray water and ambition. I sat across from Harrison, my hands steady, as I watched the printer spit out the final documents for Vance Heritage Holdings, LLC. "Delaware registration is confirmed," Harrison said, sliding a gold-plated pen toward me. "Anonymity is absolute. As far as the public record is concerned, this company is a ghost. But to Coastal Heritage Bank, you are the angel who just cleaned their balance sheet." I picked up the pen. It felt heavy, like a loaded weapon. I signed the check for $1.2 million. It was the bulk of my vested stock options and the remainder of my mother's liquid inheritance. To a normal person, it was a fortune. To me, it was the price of a cage. By buying Beatrice's defaulted debt, I wasn't just helping her. I was becoming her landlord. I was becoming the silent, invisible institution that held the power to evict the Thorne name from history. "The bank executives were thrilled to get her off their books," Harrison noted with a dry smile. "They didn't even ask who was behind the LLC. They just wanted the toxic asset gone." "Beatrice Thorne is many things, Harrison," I said, folding the documents into my leather briefcase. "But from this moment on, she is my tenant. She just doesn't know it yet." The air at 42 Church Street was thick with the scent of chamomile and deception. Beatrice was seated in the floral print armchair, her posture regal, even as the walls around her were being hollowed out by her son's greed. She was sipping tea from a delicate Wedgwood cup, the china so thin you could almost see the shadows of her fingers through it. "You're home early, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice a soft melodic warning. "I trust the forensic work didn't give you too much of a headache today." I walked into the kitchen and prepared a fresh pot of herbal tea. I moved with a practiced, submissive grace, every clink of the spoon deliberate. I carried the tray in and set it down with a soft click. I looked Julian straight in the eye as he walked in, peeling off his linen suit jacket. He looked smug, the glow of the Jasper penthouse still radiating from his skin. "I've been thinking about what you said, Julian," I said, my voice soft, laced with a carefully manufactured layer of guilt. I handed him a cup of tea, my fingers grazing his for a fraction of a second. I felt the instinctive recoil of my soul, but my face remained smooth and unreadable. Julian paused, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, I've been too selfish with my career." I continued, looking down at my lap to hide the freezing fire in my eyes. "I've been obsessed with buildings while our family was straining under the weight of this restoration. I want to make it up to you, to both of you. Please, Julian, let me take over the arrangements for Mother's 50th anniversary gala. I want to handle the contractors, the catering, the historical presentation. I want to show Charleston what it means to be a Thorne." Beatrice's teacup paused midair. Julian let out a long, arrogant breath, his chest puffing out. He looked at Beatrice, a silent signal of victory passing between them. They thought they had finally broken me. "Well," Julian said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it's about time you saw the light, Elle. I suppose I can let you handle the gala. It'll take some of the pressure off me while I finalize the other investments." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Since you're in such a helpful mood, I need you to sign these. It's just some supplementary paperwork for the insurance on the Church Street Foundation. Routine stuff. I knew exactly what it was. It was a formal transfer of my remaining personal assets, a document designed to leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back once they committed me to the hospital. Of course, I said, reaching for my bag. I turned my back to him for 3 seconds, all it took to slide his papers into my briefcase and pull out the affidavit trap Arthur Sterling had prepared. It was printed on the same weight of paper using the same font and the same Palmetto Heritage letterhead. But the third paragraph was a formal acknowledgement that Julian Thorne, acting as the sole proprietor of Palmetto Heritage, accepted full individual liability for all corporate debts, tax penalties, and civil judgments. It explicitly indemnified me from any and all financial involvement. I laid it on the table. Just then, Beatrice called out from the next room, her voice tight with manufactured distress. "Julian, sweetheart, my chest is acting up again. Could you come help me for a moment?" Julian huffed in irritation, glancing down at the stack. He saw the Palmetto Heritage letterhead, the same font, the same layout. He snatched the pen from my hand and signed it with a careless, sweeping flourish. Scritch, scratch. The sound of the pen on the paper echoed in the quiet room like a slow-motion gunshot. "There," Julian said, tossing the pen aside and standing to go to his mother. "Now we're all on the same team." "Exactly," I whispered carefully, blotting the ink before sliding the signed death warrant into my bag. Beatrice smiled at me from across the room, a cold, grandmotherly expression that didn't reach her pearls. "You've made a wise choice, Elena. A woman's place is in the heart of the home, not in its bones." Julian leaned back against the sofa a moment later, closing his eyes and looking up at the ceiling. He was likely imagining the Cooper River breeze and the white marble of his Jasper hideaway. I stood up and walked toward the doorway, my shadow stretching long and jagged across the antique Persian rug. On the wall, my silhouette looked 10 feet tall, a dark looming figure that overshadowed the Thorne legacy. The living room of 42 Church Street was bathed in the amber glow of a dozen beeswax candles. In Charleston, candlelight is usually a sign of hospitality, a warm invitation to linger over bourbon and stories. Tonight, it felt like a funeral pyre. The flames flickered in the draught, casting long, jagged shadows across the portraits of Thorne ancestors who seemed to watch me with hollow, judging eyes. The air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of gardenias and the sharp medicinal tang of Beatrice's peppermint tea. I stepped into the room, my damp trench coat dripping onto the Persian rug. They were already waiting. It was an intervention staged with the precision of a high court trial. Julian stood by the fireplace looking devastatingly handsome and profoundly concerned. Beatrice was seated on the velvet sofa, a lace handkerchief clutched in her hand. Beside her sat Reverend Miller, his face set in a mask of somber piety. And in the corner, a man I didn't recognize, a silver-haired stranger in a charcoal suit, who watched me with the predatory stillness of a clinical observer. The silence was absolute, broken only by the first heavy drops of a summer storm tapping against the tall windows like bony fingers. "Elena, dear." Beatrice said, her voice trembling with a practiced melodic grief. She stood up and crossed the room, taking my cold hands in hers. Her palms were dry like ancient parchment. "Bless your heart, we've been so worried. We've been sitting here praying for the strength to do what must be done." "What exactly must be done, Beatrice?" I asked. My voice was a low, steady hum devoid of the hysteria they were clearly hunting for. Beatrice squeezed my fingers, leaning in until I could see the fine lines of malice around her eyes. "We love you, Elena, but you aren't well. This obsession with forensics, these delusions about Julian and the house. It's clear you're working yourself into a breakdown. You're seeing ghosts in the walls because you haven't processed your mother's tragedy." She looked back at the stranger in the corner. This is Dr. Eris, a dear friend of the family. He's reviewed the incidents Julian has documented. He agrees that you need rest. Real rest. At a private facility Julian has so thoughtfully arranged outside of the city. Julian stepped forward, his face a mask of faux devotion. He held a silver fountain pen and a set of voluntary commitment papers. It's for the best, Elle, Julian whispered. You need to step away from the blueprints for a while. Let me handle the burden of the Thorne estate while you get the help you need. I looked at the papers. Then I looked at Julian. And if I decline your thoughtful arrangement, the mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, the charismatic builder vanished, replaced by the shark I had seen in the Jasper penthouse. Then we have a problem, Julian said, his voice dropping into a cold, flat register. Because as your husband and the new legal conservator of the Thorne interests, I've decided that your father's care is becoming a financial strain we can no longer justify. If you don't sign these papers, if you don't go quietly, I'll have Caleb moved by morning. There's a state-funded facility in the upstate Oconee County. It's a 6-hour drive. It's understaffed, underfunded, and they don't allow private visitors for the first 90 days of adjustment. Oh. He leaned closer, his eyes twin voids of black ink. You'll never see him again, Elena. He'll die in a white room smelling of bleach, wondering why his daughter abandoned him. The Reverend cleared his throat, nodding solemnly. A wife must trust her husband's leadership, Elena, especially when her mind is clouded by the shadows of the past. I looked at the four of them. They weren't a family. They were a demolition crew that thought it had trapped me, not knowing Julian's signature on the affidavit from the night before had already stripped him of every legal right he was currently trying to exercise. I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, a slow, chilling expression that made Beatrice's grip on my hand falter. She stepped back, her eyes widening. Give me the pen, Julian, I said. Julian's smirk returned triumphant and ugly. He handed me the fountain pen. I sat at the antique desk and signed the papers with a sweeping, graceful flourish. To them, it was my surrender. To me, it was a piece of theater meant to keep them complacent for the next 24 hours. I stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the mahogany floor. I adjusted the collar of my damp coat, looking at Beatrice, who was now clutching her pearls, as if they could protect her from the sudden shift in the room's temperature. There, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow silence. I hope you're satisfied. It's for your own good, Elena, Julian said, reaching for the papers. I'm sure it is, I replied. I walked toward the staircase, pausing at the first step. I turned back, the candlelight reflecting in my eyes like cold blue diamonds. I'll be in my room preparing. But don't worry about the facility just yet. I'll see you both at the gala tomorrow night. After all, it's the 50th anniversary. It's going to be the most radiant night the Thorne family has ever seen. Elena. Julian started, but I was already moving. I walked up the sweeping marble staircase, my heels clicking a steady, lethal rhythm. The thunder finally broke over Church Street, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the house. On the wall beside me, my shadow stretched out, massive and jagged, morphing into the silhouette of a vengeful goddess, illuminated by a flash of lightning. I reached the landing and didn't look back. Below me, the candles flickered and died in the sudden gust of the storm, leaving the Thorne family in the dark they had spent so much money to create. The Dock Street Theater is a cathedral of Charleston's vanities. Beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers and the ornate plasterwork of the oldest playhouse in America, the city's elite gathered in a cloud of expensive bourbon and vintage Chanel. It was a sea of tuxedos and heirloom pearls, a room full of people who believed that if you maintained the facade long enough, the rot beneath didn't exist. I walked through the lobby, my heels striking the heart pine floors with a lethal rhythmic precision. I wasn't wearing the soft lavender silk Beatrice had suggested. I wore a black tailored silk dress with shoulders sharp enough to draw blood. No jewelry, no distractions. I looked like a silent invitation to a funeral. Julian stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in one hand, his other draped possessively over my shoulder. He was beaming, radiating the smug confidence of a man who believed that by morning, I'd be behind the locked doors of a psychiatric ward. "Doesn't she look lovely?" Beatrice cooed to a group of garden club matrons, her hand grazing my arm. Her eyes were hard as flint. "We're so glad she's finally found the clarity to join us tonight." I offered her a smile that held the temperature of a morgue. "Tonight will be unforgettable, Beatrice. I've made sure of it." The lights dimmed. The chatter of 100 socialites died down to a hungry murmur as Beatrice Thorne took the stage. 50 years? Beatrice began, her voice amplified and honey dripping with the fake humility of the Southern elite. 50 years of elegance, of legacy. Tonight, as we look back at the history of the Thorne School, we celebrate the foundations that keep us strong. She gestured toward the massive projection screen. "Please join us in a journey through our heritage." The film began, but it wasn't the black and white footage of ballerinas Beatrice expected. The first image to flicker onto the screen was a high-resolution FLIR thermal scan of 42 Church Street. The theater went dead silent. The screen was a nightmare of neon blue, deep abyssal voids, where the structural beams should have been. "What is this?" Julian hissed beside me, his grip on my arm tightening. The image shifted. It was a video, grainy but clear, filmed through glass. It was the Jasper penthouse. Julian's voice boomed through the theater's state-of-the-art sound system, echoing off the mahogany rafters. "My wife is nothing but a stone wallet, babe. Once this project is wrapped up, she's headed straight for the psych ward, just like her mother before her. And I'll be her legal conservator." A collective, jagged gasp ripped through the audience. I felt Julian's body go rigid. Beside him, Beatrice had gone a sickening shade of gray, her mouth opening and closing like a fish thrown onto dry land. The screen flickered again. A massive high-definition scan of the quitclaim deed appeared. The forged signature zoomed in until the digital pixels looked like scars. It was immediately followed by the affidavit Julian had signed 48 hours ago, the one where he accepted full individual liability for the RICO-level fraud of Palmetto Heritage. The silence in the Dock Street Theater was no longer polite. It was a clinical, suffocating weight. The elites of Charleston, the people Julian and Beatrice had spent their lives trying to impress, were now staring at them with a mixture of horror and predatory disgust. "Elena, stop this!" Julian stammered, his voice breaking. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for a foundation that was no longer there. "I didn't do it, Julian," I whispered, my voice carrying into the silent rows. "The house did. It just couldn't hold the weight of your lies anymore." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the theater swung open. A dozen men in dark suits and windbreakers emblazoned with FBI and IRS criminal investigation marched down the aisles. They didn't head for the crazy wife. They didn't look at the stage. They walked straight to the front row. "Julian Thorne." The lead agent asked, his voice booming over the sound of Beatrice's muffled whimpering. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and RICO violations. You have the right to remain silent." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the theater, a sound more final than any gavel. Julian didn't fight. He collapsed inward, his shoulders sagging, his face a ruin of sweat and shattered ego. He looked at me pleading, but I saw nothing but a failed structure. I stepped onto the stage, walking past a catatonic Beatrice. I took the microphone from the stand. The feedback hummed for a second, then cleared. I looked directly at Julian as they began to lead him away in front of everyone he'd ever lied to. "You built your life on lies, Julian." I said, my voice echoing like a cold wind through the rafters. "You chose the wrong materials." I simply pulled the last load-bearing beam. Beatrice suddenly found her voice. It was a shriek of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You psycho!" Beatrice screamed, lunging toward the stage, her beaded gown rustling violently. "Police! Someone arrest her! She's trespassing. She's a clinical maniac. This is my school. This is my theater." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single embossed document from Vance Heritage Holdings. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. This school was the collateral for a debt you couldn't pay, Beatrice. I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute finality. Coastal Heritage Bank sold that debt to my firm 48 hours ago. The foreclosure was executed at 9 a.m. this morning. I leaned over the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had tried to erase my mind. "I'm not your daughter-in-law anymore, Beatrice. I'm your creditor. And you have exactly 1 hour to vacate my property before I have the marshals remove you for trespassing." The silence returned deeper than before. I turned and walked off the stage. The elite of Charleston parted like the Red Sea as I walked down the center aisle. They didn't speak. They didn't offer comfort. They just watched as Elena Vance, the carpenter's daughter, walked out of the ruins of the Thorne dynasty. I stepped out into the humid Charleston night. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and the cobblestones shimmering like diamonds. The sidewalk in front of the Dock Street Theater was a gauntlet of flashing lights and judging eyes. The humidity had returned thick and heavy, making the air feel like it was clinging to the scandal, refusing to let it wash away. Julian was being led toward a black SUV, his hands cuffed behind his back. The sharp, rhythmic click-clack of news cameras was the only soundtrack to his descent. Under the harsh, artificial glare of the strobe lights, Julian looked less like a scion of Charleston and more like a frightened boy caught in a lie too big to breathe through. His linen suit, once the symbol of his unearned status, was wrinkled and sweat-stained. He stopped near the car door, his eyes darting frantically through the crowd until they landed on Beatrice. "Mother?" Julian's voice was a ragged plea cracking with a desperation that made the nearby socialites recoil. "Tell them. Tell them it's a mistake. Call the governor. Call." Beatrice Thorne didn't step forward. She didn't even flinch. She stood on the theater steps, her chin tilted at an angle that suggested she was still presiding over a debutante ball rather than a federal arrest. She looked at a reporter from the Post and Courier who had thrust a microphone toward her. "The Thorne family has always held itself to the highest standards of the law," Beatrice said, her voice projecting a chilling, practiced calm. "If Julian has engaged in these unfortunate irregularities, he has done so entirely on his own. I had no knowledge of his business dealings. I am as shocked as the rest of Charleston." Julian's face went slack. The betrayal was so total, so surgical, that it seemed to physically deflate him. He stared at his mother, the woman who had directed his every move, the woman whose school he was trying to save with my stolen equity, and realized he was nothing more than a discarded load-bearing wall to her. The FBI agent pushed Julian's head down, ducking him into the back of the SUV. The door slammed with a heavy metallic thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Beatrice turned her gaze to me. Even in the ruins of her life, she tried to find a weapon. "You think you've won, you little viper?" she hissed, stepping close enough that I could smell the stale chamomile on her breath. "You've destroyed a legacy. You've spat on the traditions that made this city. My ancestors built Charleston. Yours just hauled the bricks." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't feel the weight of her judgment. I felt the lightness of a structure that had been cleared of its hazardous waste. Tradition is about the strength of the material, Beatrice. It's about building something that can withstand the salt and the storm. My family built things to last. Yours just built things to look at. I walked away, the sound of my heels on the pavement steady and sure. 6 blocks away, the Jasper penthouse was a different kind of crime scene. Sienna, or Madison, as the forged documents called her, wasn't waiting for the police. The sound of her designer suitcase wheels rolling across the white marble floor was a frantic staccato beat. Thrum, thrum, thrum. She moved through the master suite like a whirlwind, snatching Louis Vuitton bags from the closet and dumping jewelry boxes into her carry-on. She was down the service elevator and into a waiting Uber 3 minutes before the first blue light of a patrol car flickered at the Jasper's entrance. She stopped at the Marble Island to grab her keys and saw a framed photo of her and Julian, taken at a vineyard in Napa. They both looked beautiful. They both looked perfect. Sienna swept the frame off the counter. It hit the floor with a sharp shatter, the glass spraying across the polished stone. She didn't even look at the photograph as she stepped over it, her heels crunching the glass into fine powder. I stood alone on the sidewalk of Church Street. The storm had left the air smelling of ozone and wet earth. 42 Church Street stood before me, draped in the shadows of the oaks. A large red adhesive seal had been placed across the mahogany front doors. It bore the logo of Vance Heritage Holdings. I walked up the steps and touched the seal. The paper was cool and crisp under my fingertips. I thought I would feel a surge of triumph, a roar of victory. But as I stood there in the silence of the night, all I felt was a profound clinical catharsis. It was the feeling an architect gets when a dangerous condemned building is finally leveled, leaving a clean, empty lot ready for a new foundation. The thorn name had been a parasite on this wood, a slow-acting poison in the mortar. Now the site was clear. I looked down at my hand. The red mark from the key Martha had given me had faded into a faint pale scar, a permanent reminder of the price of the truth. In the intake center of the Charleston County Jail, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and stale sweat. Julian sat on a hard plastic bench, his linen suit ruined, his silk tie confiscated. He looked at the wall, his mind likely looping the image of his mother turning her back on him. "I need to make a call," he muttered to the guard. I have resources. I need my lawyer." "You get one call, Thorne," the guard said, sliding a phone across the desk. Julian dialed Sienna's number. He waited, his heart thudding against his ribs. "Please, babe, pick up. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." He dialed again, then again. Each time the mechanical voice was the only answer. He tried his mother's private line. It went straight to a generic voicemail. Julian lowered the phone. He looked at his hands, the hands that had forged my name, the hands that had tried to steal my future. They were empty. The sunlight in Charleston this morning didn't feel like a weight. It was a golden benediction filtering through the ancient live oaks and washing over the bricks of 42 Church Street with a clarity I hadn't seen in years. I stood in the grand foyer, the air smelling of linseed oil, fresh sawdust, and the honest, sharp scent of cedar. I wasn't wearing silk or pearls. I was in my work khakis, my sleeves rolled up, a chisel in my hand. I spent the morning stripping away the legendary restoration Julian had bragged about. Beneath his thin, expensive-looking veneers and the cheap aluminum studs, I found the truth. I uncovered the original heart pine beams, scorched by time, but unyielding. I exposed the handmade bricks, each one bearing the slight thumbprint of a craftsman from the 1820s. The house was finally breathing again. It wasn't a stage set for a Thorne drama anymore. It was a structure built on the integrity of the material. I heard the soft hum of wheels against the hardwood. I turned as the nurse helped my father, Caleb, onto the piazza. I took over, pushing his chair into the warm, salty breeze coming off the harbor. Caleb looked out at the water, his face fuller now, the gray pallor of the hospital replaced by a healthy coastal tan. He reached out his gnarled hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the new railing I'd finished yesterday. I had used the Vance family mortise and tenon joints, fitted so perfectly they required no nails. His eyes moved to mine, and for the first time since the stroke, the frustration was gone. He ran his thumb over a dovetail joint, his eyes shining with a fierce, silent pride. He didn't have the words, but he didn't need them. The language of the wood was enough. 500 miles away at the Federal Correctional Institution in Butner, the air was the color of concrete and smelled of industrial floor wax. Julian Thorne was leaning on a broom sweeping the dust of a communal hallway. His tan jumpsuit was ill-fitting, the fabric stiff and abrasive against his skin. His hands, once manicured for the benefit of country club investors, were now calloused and stained. He stopped near a trash bin, his eyes catching a glimpse of a glossy cover sticking out from a pile of discarded mail. It was a recent issue of the Southern Architect. Julian froze. There, on the cover, was a photo of me. I was standing in the center of 42 Church Street, the sunlight hitting the restored beams behind me. I looked radiant, my eyes sharp and unforgivingly clear. The headline read, "Elena Vance, Preserving the Soul of Charleston." Beneath the main title, a smaller caption detailed the launch of the Vance Craftsmanship Fund, an endowment I had established to provide trade scholarships for children from the city's working-class neighborhoods. Julian stared at the image until a guard barked an order for him to keep moving. He looked back at the dust at his feet, realizing that while he had tried to build a life on the stolen equity of my past, I had built a future on the unshakable truth of my own name. He had no mistress. He had no mother. He was just a number in a hallway, swept into the corners of a world that had moved on without him. I stood on the piazza watching the sun climb higher over the Cooper River. I had received a letter from Beatrice yesterday, a desperate scribbled note from a rundown apartment complex in West Ashley. She was asking for temporary assistance to maintain her standing in the garden club. I hadn't replied. I simply filed it under debris and moved on. My phone vibrated on the railing. It was a message from Arthur Sterling. "The Thorne name has been legally removed from all Vance assets. The severance is absolute. Congratulations, Elena." I looked at the house. I looked at my father. I looked at my own hands, which were covered in the dust of a new beginning. I inhaled the salt air, watching the first light of a new Charleston day ignite the harbor. The morning was quiet. The mists were gone. And for the first time I could see for miles.